Thanks.
So go ahead and test with the captionist.
Okay.
Archive reporting, are you receiving our audio?
Well, the captioner, can you hear me?
They can hear you, probably. There'll be about 40 seconds delay to a minute before they can get it. So.
There's a 40-second delay from our audio to them.
Okay, so that whatever goes in here will take 40 seconds to come out there.
For them to hear it.
Okay.
And then they type it, and it types instantly here because this is the website.
Right. In your introduction, you should make sure that's clear. Okay. Hello there, captioner. Thanks. It's always kind of like talking to a deity. In other words, I say something, an answer comes out there.
Right. So you could ask a question, and maybe the answer will appear.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
okay.
Capture it. What is the meaning of life? Okay. Good.
All that miking, and I forgot to mic myself up. Welcome, and thank you, everyone, for coming, especially on a rainy day like today. Let me take a moment and point out that we have evaluation forms on the blue sheets on either side of the room with the short, undesirable, and less likely to be stolen library pencils. Feel free to use your own writing instrument if you prefer. So after the presentation, if you would take a moment to fill out a form and pile them up on either side, and I'll collect them up. So let me first take a moment to thank our numerous and generous sponsors for this event. It's a long list. Lots of people were very happy to contribute, much to my pleasure. So let me just do the necessary deed and rattle off the list of donors. Institute of Arts and Humanities, Office of the Vice Provost for Educational Equity, the College of Liberal Arts, the Presidential Leadership Academy, the Schreyer Honors College, Teaching and Learning with Technology, the College of Communications, the School of Engineering, Design, Technology, and Professional Programs, the Office of Disability Services, the College of Health and Human Development, the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders, and finally, Adaptive Technology Services in the university libraries. So if we could just take a quick second and give everybody from those units a quick round of applause, because there are representatives from all those units here. I first encountered Dr. Michael Chorost's book, Rebuilt, when my own already fairly profound hearing loss fell even further off a cliff. One of my options was to get an implant. But how could I possibly get an implant when I'd already been interviewed by NPR as being anti-cochlear implants? Very anti-cochlear implants. So I went on the internet, did my research, and I found his book, which had been published just a year or two before I was due to get my own. And it changed my life. I am so grateful that book was written, because for the first time I had an end user's perspective on the science of an implant, and I knew after reading his book that there was a really good chance the implants would work for me. So thank you for writing that life-changing book. I really appreciate that you're here today. Without further ado, may I present Dr. Michael Chorost.
Thank you all so much for coming today. And thanks to Penn State University for inviting me, and especially to Alexa, who moved heaven and earth to arrange all the different sponsorships to get me here. So I'm very excited to be here at Penn State today. Before I go on, I want to check, is my mic working? Can everybody hear me? You're back? You hearing me? Okay, good. So my title for today is How to Put Your Brain on the Internet, Lessons from a Cyborg. So my talk is really going to be in two parts. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to talk about my own experience as a cyborg, as a person with a cochlear implant like Alexa. I went through that process of finding out what it is actually like to have a computer surgically implanted in your head to control your auditory world. So that really taught me a great deal. Among other things, it taught me that it is possible to put a computer inside a human nervous system and make a brain believe that it is hearing. In other words, to make my completely deaf brain believe that it is hearing. So that taught me a very profound lesson of what technology can do, that you can make a brain believe that it is receiving sound by plugging electrodes into it and stimulating them with electricity. So that is where I come from today. I come from the perspective of someone who actually has a cyborg kind of technology. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the answer to that question, how to put your brain on the internet. And I'm going to try to convince you that even though that's not possible today, that it has become thinkable in a way that was not available just 5 or 10 years ago. I want to start with a very fundamental question that you might be asking yourself. And the question is, why? Why bother putting your brain on the internet? What good is it to do that? And I'd like to give you a little primer on the history of technology to point out that every time a new technology appears, one of the first questions is, why bother? Why do this? What good is it? Start with Plato. 2,400 years ago, in his dialogue, The Phaedrus, Plato complains that the new technology of writing was a problem for education. He argued that real learning takes place in conversation, that real learning only takes place when two people meet face to face and talk. Plato complains that writing had the limitation of if you read it and didn't understand it and asked the text a question, it would just give you the same answer again. You couldn't have a conversation with it. So Plato complained 2,400 years ago that the technology of writing was subverting education, that it was a threat to the raising of educated people. Writing, mind you. Fast forward to about 1455, when Gutenberg invented the printing press. Again, people asked, why bother? We can already create books by writing them out. We have whole squadrons of monks and clerks to do that job. Why do it mechanically? Another set of people didn't just ask why. People in the church said, oh no, this is a really bad idea. Once it becomes possible to print Bibles cheaply so that anyone can buy one and read it, then our church loses its ability to control the meaning of the Bible. Printing is a really bad idea. We shouldn't do it. Fast forward again to email, which became popular around 1992, 1993. I think most of you in this room are not old enough to remember that. I am. But at that time, people again asked, why? Why bother to use email? We can just send memos. We can just pick up the telephone. What people failed to anticipate was that email was not just a faster way of sending memos. It was also, or rather it became, a completely new kind of communication. A great deal of the work that people did in offices used to be writing memos and being in meetings and calling each other on the telephone. But then email itself became the medium in which work happens. That radically reconfigured the way people do work. So just to go with those 3 examples, Plato and writing, Gutenberg and the printing press, and email. In all 3 cases, the question was, why bother? And often the reaction was, this is a really bad idea. We shouldn't do this. So you may be asking a similar question. Why bother putting your brain on the internet? What good is it? So I'm going to try to explain, when I get to that part of my talk, what good it could be. But I'm somewhat in the position of someone in 1985 trying to predict the impact of email, or someone in the year 2000 trying to predict the impact of the iPhone. You can't really fully do it, right? Nobody could predict the impacts of technologies. However, it's almost always a safe bet to predict that the impact will be profound. Whenever new communication technologies are invented, they have a way of changing not just the world, but the way people relate to each other. So that is the structure of my talk. I'm going to talk about my own cyborgness, and I'll talk about possibly your cyborgness, or your children's cyborgness, and try to show you how that might happen and what it might mean. In my talk, I encourage you to raise your hand and ask questions at any time. My own talk will probably take about an hour to go through all my slides, and then we'll have about another hour for as much discussion and conversation as you wish. My only limitation is that I have to go at 5. All right, everybody clear on the plan? Okay, let's get started. So let me first talk about what gives me the authority to be here today. And Alexa actually partly answered that question. So let me tell you my story. On the day of July 7th, 2001, I was a hearing aid user. My mother had rubella when she was pregnant with me in 1964. So I was born with profound hearing losses in both ears. I could hear loud sounds. So my parents didn't realize I was deaf until I was 3.5. Because when they clapped or when they banged on something, I would turn around. Oh, the kid can't be deaf. He's responding to sound. But my hearing was too poor for me to hear speech. That was the crucial thing that I was missing. So until I was 3.5 years old, I never heard a human voice. So that means that for the first 3.5 years of my life, I was basically an animal. I was an intelligent, languageless animal. It was only when I got hearing aids and began having access to sound, to speech, that I began to acquire English. So I grew up in my early childhood as a totally deaf person. With hearing aids, I heard quite well. I heard well enough to pick up spoken language. So between the ages of 3.5 and 36, I was a hearing aid user. I was a person with impaired hearing. On July 7th, 2001, that changed dramatically. I was in Reno, Nevada. I was in town for a business trip. I had gotten off the airplane about half an hour before. I was standing at the Enterprise rent-a-car waiting for my car to be driven up. So I was just standing there fidgeting, just, okay, come on, time for the car to arrive. And then suddenly I thought that the battery in my left hearing aid had died, because all of a sudden the world sounded much quieter than before. The traffic on the road about 100 feet away was suddenly whisper soft. I tried fiddling with the volume wheel. That didn't help. I thought, okay, it's a dead battery. So I put in a new battery. That didn't make any difference. I thought, gosh, maybe it's a defective battery. So I put in another battery. That didn't help. Then I thought, gee, maybe there's a problem with my left hearing aid. So I switched my hearing aids. I took the right hearing aid and put it into the left ear. It sounded exactly the same. That didn't help. Then it started to dawn on me that the problem was not my batteries or my hearing aids. The problem was my ears. So I took the rental car that had just been driven up, got in, and drove to the emergency room in Tahoe. That day, over the next 4 hours, I lost all of the hearing in my good ear, my left ear. My right ear has never really done much for me. I've always been a left-eared person. So when the left ear died, I went from having a hearing loss to being totally deaf in about 4 hours. So I flew into Tahoe, Reno, a hearing impaired person. I flew out a completely deaf one. On the plane ride back, I had two main thoughts. The first thought was, now it's time to get a cochlear implant, because I knew about the technology. I just never imagined that I would actually need it. The second thought was, I'll bet I could write a book about the experience I'm about to have. And that's what I did. I'm a writer by nature. I came home, went straight to the keyboard, and I started keeping a diary of my experiences, of going through the medical process, getting a diagnosis, going through MRIs, going through surgery, getting the implant. Those diary notes became my first book, Rebuilt, which you can see here. So that is actually an X-ray, a CAT scan of my skull on the cover. And you can see here the cochlear implant that is embedded in my skull. I'd like to think I'm the only author in publishing history with a picture of the outside of his head on the book jacket, that's my face, and a picture of the inside of his head on the book cover. That really is my own head there. If you took my X-ray now, it would look different because I now have two cochlear implants. So you would see a second cochlear implant sort of in shadow behind the first one. That came out in 2005, and I'm actually thinking about aiming for a 10-year reissue, by the way, because the book is out of date now. I need to bring it back up to date. This is the paperback version of the book, and the publisher wanted the cover to be more family-friendly somehow. They thought that the skull and the implant were too scary for readers, so they wanted something a little softer and cuter. So they asked me for a picture of my graduation from my nursery school for deaf children. So there I am receiving my diploma from nursery school, which I still have on my wall next to my doctoral diploma. I think it's a nice beginning and end. And then, a couple of years ago, in 2011, I came out with my second book, Worldwide Mind, the coming integration of humans, computers, and the Internet. So really, this book is the first half of my talk. This book is the second half of my talk. So let's go on to talk about cochlear implant 101. What is a cochlear implant? How does the thing actually work? So there's a lot to explain here. So let me take you through it piece by piece. Let's start with the piece that you see in the back of my head. And you probably had a good opportunity to look at it while I was turned around like this. So you can see two discs on the back of my head. You can also see two discs on the back of Alexa's head. She's got the same technology. It's by a different manufacturer. She has cochlear implants made by MED-EL. I have cochlear implants made by Advanced Bionics. The fundamental principles, however, are pretty much the same. So what is this disc? Well, start with this device here, which looks like a hearing aid, but it's not a hearing aid. I'm totally deaf. A hearing aid is just an amplifier. It makes sound really loud so that whatever's left of the ear can pick it up. But I have no remaining hearing. It doesn't matter how loud a hearing aid makes a sound. I will not hear it. When I shave with an electric razor with these off, I can't hear it at all. That's a little spooky for me. Because before, when I had hearing aids, I could hear loud sounds. I could hear the razor. Now, it's total silence. So it's just as if you're completely blind, the strongest glasses in the world will do nothing for you. So a cochlear implant has a piece that looks like a hearing aid, but its output is data rather than sound. This little gadget here is a microphone. It picks up sound from the world around. And you can see that the microphone sits inside the shell of my ear where it picks up sound. It actually uses the cup of the ear as a natural amplifier. This part here has a rechargeable battery, and there are several computer chips in here whose job is to digitize the incoming sound and translate it into a long string of ones and zeros, a string of data. That data is sent to this round disk, which has two things in it. It's got a magnet in it, and I'll prove that to you in a second. It will stick to anything that's made of metal, okay? So there's a magnet in there. There's also a radio transmitter in there. The radio transmitter's job is to send that string of ones and zeros through my skin to the implant embedded in my skull. Everybody with me so far? Now, you may be wondering why you don't see anything there except hair. That's because the implant is underneath the skin. There's no exposure of it to the outside world. That's why you need a radio signal to send the data through the skin. The skin is completely intact. I can take a shower, go swimming like anyone else. I just have to take this device off so I can't hear. So that is what's on the outside of my body. The processor, the headpiece with its transmitter. Now, let's take a look at what's inside the body. So you see here the headpiece, which has the magnet and the radio transmitter that is sending the data through my skin to an implant that's embedded in my skull. And it is sitting on top of my skull, just underneath the skin. I've got a really gory picture which will prove that to your satisfaction, I hope. So this picks up the radio signal, decodes it, and it sends it down a wire through a tunnel drilled through bone, through my middle ear, into the inner ear, the cochlea. This is the part of the ear that in most cases is the reason that people go deaf. In a normal ear, this is what happens. Sound comes into the ear canal, it hits the eardrum vibrates. Those vibrations are transmitted through these tiny bones, 3 of them, the smallest bones in the body, into the cochlea. The cochlea, the word is a Latin word for snail. And you can see why. It's a snail-shaped organ. Inside the cochlea are tens of thousands of tiny little hairs. They're not hairs like hairs on one's head. They're tiny little cilia. And as those hairs are moved back and forth by the sound waves, they trigger nerve endings underneath them. And those nerve endings are tied together into a big trunk line, the auditory nerve that goes to the brain. That's a normal ear. Any questions about normal ears? Now, in my case, the reason I'm deaf is because the tiny little hairs in here have been killed off. First, by the rubella virus. The rubella virus is, with the turnaround, the hairs inside the cochlea are especially sensitive to the impact of the rubella virus. So in my case, many of those hairs probably never grew in the first place. I had some when I was born, not all of them. So the hairs are missing, but the nerves are still there. The nerves are completely intact. There's just no way to trigger them because there's no little hair cells left. So how do you do that? How do you trigger nerves? The answer is with electricity. So what a surgeon did back in 2001 was to insert an electrode array with 16 electrodes in it inside my cochlea. And those electrodes, you can see them right here, face inward into the center of the cochlea. And as those electrodes fire, they make these nerve endings send sound signals to the brain. So it is forcing the nerves with electricity to send the sound signals that before happened with mechanical stimulation. So what a cochlear implant is doing is it's replacing the mechanical stimulation of a normal cochlea with an electrical system that plays the nerves of the cochlea like a piano. And that is what makes me hear. That's Cochlear Implant 101. Any questions about this technology before we go on? Yes, sir.
So we're talking about the comparison between mechanical
Yes, thank you, Alexa.
So you're talking about the difference between the mechanicalness of the eardrum versus the electrical stimulation with the implant. Is the reproduction of sound the same as the mechanical eardrum, or is there a certain percentage loss of quality or anything like that with the electrical stimulation?
Okay, that's a great question. The question is, how does the sound compare? Do I hear what a normally hearing person does? The answer is no, not at all. And I actually have a slide that simulates the output of a cochlear implant. So So in a moment, you will get to hear a simulacrum of what I hear. But let's first answer the question from a technical standpoint. Think about something. Inside a normally functioning cochlea are about 12,500 hair cells, and each hair cell resonates to a unique frequency. So roughly, very roughly, the ear can tell the difference between 12,500 different pitches, the frequency range. A cochlear implant electrode, the one I'm using, has 16 electrodes. So you are replacing 12,500 hair cells with 16 electrodes. What you're going to get is a certain reduction in resolution of frequency. Okay. Now, different implants have different numbers of electrodes. So in your case, Alexa, how many electrodes do you have in your device? 12. Okay, Alexa's device has 12 electrodes. Mine has 16. There's another company called Cochlear whose devices have 22 electrodes. Are more electrodes better? Actually, no. It's been found that the number of electrodes has almost no relationship on how well the person ends up hearing. But what I hear is a low-resolution version of what you hear. Now let me talk a little bit about what that was like when it was first turned on in October 2001. I had no idea what to expect. I'd been through the surgery. I'd had to wait about 3 weeks for the incision to heal before they gave me the external processor that turned the system on. So I spent 3 weeks after the surgery, like, okay, now what? What am I going to hear? What I thought I was going to hear was going to be fuzzy sound. I was completely unprepared for the fact that my hearing was both much better and much worse than it was with hearing aids that first day. It was much better in the sense that my acuity was much better because the electrode array was stimulating most of my cochlea. Whereas before the hair cells, there were probably whole sections where there were no hair cells left, where I didn't hear anything. But now I had electrodes making everything fire. So I found that very first day, I could hear a pin being dropped onto a floor. In my office, with hearing aids, I could hear my clock ticking about 5 feet away. With my implant, I found I could hear it ticking 20 feet away. So immediately, my hearing was so eerily, freakily good. On the other hand, I turned on the radio, coming home from the audiologist appointment. I could not understand a single word. I tried calling my mother on the telephone, gibberish. I could not make out anything at all. So my hearing was both weirdly much better and weirdly much worse that first day. And part of the reason is, A, the lack of resolution had changed the way signals get sent down the hearing nerve. The implant was giving me a ton of information. My brain did not know how to decode that information. Simple sounds were easy. Clocks ticking. That I can make sense of. A complicated waveform like a voice, it sent a signal down here that my brain could not make out. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what that sounded like. So let's go on to the next slide. Actually, the sound slide, that's coming up. Okay, I will play that simulation. But first I want to prove to your satisfaction, okay, that the cochlear implant is embedded in my skull underneath the skin. This is a slide that I always love to show people shortly after lunch, okay? Because this really shows that a cochlear implant, it's not some kind of comic book technology. It really is metal and silicon and blood and body fluids. So what you're seeing here, this is somebody else's implant. This is not my implant, okay? However, the implant that I have in my left ear is the same as that implant. So this is what you would see if you're looking down my head from this perspective, okay? The back of the head would be around here. The ear canal would be around there. The shell of the ear itself would be roughly around here. The face would be here, okay? So that's the orientation. And you can see here that the surgeon has drilled out a hollow in the top of the skull about the shape and size of the implant, countersunk it into place, tied it down with metal sutures so that it doesn't go anywhere, and then drilled a tunnel through the bone to put the electrode array into the cochlea. That tunnel goes through about 1.5 inches of bone. The surgeon goes real deep during that operation. You know, another thing that I like about this picture, apart from the fact that it's gory, okay, is the fact that here it says Advanced Bionics, brand name, okay, Clarion Platinum Series, C2, model such and such, this side out. This side out. So I've got I've got something in my head that says this side out. And of course the reason is, how does this thing stick to my head? It does it because there's a magnet inside the body of the implant. And the magnet's polarity have to be opposed to each other. Otherwise the headpiece would just fly off my head. So you really want to make sure the surgeon puts the implant in this side out. Okay, now if you could open up that device, this is what you would see. You'd see a set of computer chips. And that's what's inside the thing. That is the circuitry that decodes the incoming input and decides which electrodes to fire. On the other side of that little circuit board is the radio antenna that picks up the sound that comes, that picks up the radio signal that comes from the headpiece. Okay, any more questions on this technology before I go on? Yes?
Since it is technology, how
Oh, wait, we need to wait for the mic, sorry.
Since it is just like technology like anything else, does it last forever or does it eventually stop working as it does now, or how does that work?
Well, I sure hope the electrodes never stop working. The question is, how long does it last? And the answer is, it's supposed to last for the lifetime of the user. My surgeon has told me that in my lifetime, there's about a 10% chance that one or the other of my devices may fail. And when that happens, you just replace it. The surgeon just goes in, takes the old one out, puts the new one in, and usually the new one works as well or better than the old one. But that isn't supposed to happen. The device is hermetically sealed so that no body fluids can get in, and it's supposed to stay that way. Any other questions? Let's go on. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about what makes this work? What's the code underneath this device? How do you know which electrodes to fire? And the answer is that the cochlea is very cleverly laid out like a piano keyboard in a spiral. So the nerve endings at the base of the cochlea code for high-frequency sounds. The ones all the way up at the tippy top at the apex code for low-frequency sounds. Very clever. It makes it very simple. If you want to give me a percept of a high-pitched sound, like, for example, that's a high-pitched sound. When that comes into my system, mostly it's these electrodes that fire to convey that sound. When a low-pitched sound comes in, like my own voice, that is mostly conveyed by these electrodes up at the top of the electrode array. So the software takes sound apart and it feeds it back into various electrodes. So that's how the software works. Okay, so you may be wondering, well, how many cochlear implant users are there? Well, there's at least two. There's me and there's Alexa. Okay. Also sharing. Oh, well, congratulations. I didn't know that. Okay, so that's three. All right. If you keep counting, as of roughly 2012, there were about 324,000 cochlear implant users. What's kind of cool is that for me, when I was first implanted in 2001, that number was about 50,000. So there's roughly 7 times as many cochlear implant users in the world as there were when I was first implanted. So the number has really grown. Okay, so now I'm going to try to convey to you what it sounds like to hear through a cochlear implant. Let me issue a couple of caveats, okay? First of all, this is a simulation of the output of a cochlear implant. It's what the electronics send to my auditory nerve. What it doesn't tell you is how my brain decodes that information, okay? Also, it's different by manufacturer. Different manufacturers use different algorithms. So this is sort of a generic algorithm. So this won't tell you exactly what I hear, but it will give you some idea. So let me explain what you're about to hear. So it's an English sentence that has been electronically filtered to resemble the output of a cochlear implant. And it comes in a number of versions. The one-channel version corresponds to the very earliest cochlear implants, which had one electrode. So they took all the frequencies of the world, high and low, and stuffed them all into a single place in the cochlea. Later cochlear implants had more electrodes, in my case up to about 16. So this is a simulation of what happens when you take a sound, break it up into 16 frequency bands, and send each band to one electrode. Your task is going to be to figure out what the sentence is. I'm going to play them in order. First the one channel, then the two channel, all the way up to 16 channel. And then I will play you the original unedited version of the sentence. All right? Everybody with me? Okay, let's go to it. Okay, one channel. Let's see. Okay, I'm not getting anything. Can we turn the volume up? If you think you didn't hear me, you think you were right. Let's give it another shot. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Now, is that loud enough for you to hear? Okay, you can hear. Can anybody figure out what the sentence is? I'll play it again. Gibberish, right? 2 electrodes, 2 channels. Any guesses? 4 channels, 4 electrodes. I'm going to play that again. Now, you're cheating because you have a cochlear implant. But can you say that again? Can you say that again?
I like to play tennis.
I like to play tennis. Okay. Anybody else? Anyone else want to offer a guess? Yes. Chess. Okay. So you're guessing I like to play chess?
I thought it was chess instead of tennis at the
Okay.
end.
So the second guess is I like to play chess. Okay. Anybody else? I'll play it one more time.
I like to play cash. I thought it was I'd like to pay cash.
I like to pay cash. Okay. All right. So clearly we're not coming to consensus here yet, right? Okay. Because this is a very low resolution version of the sentence. Now I'm going to play 8 channels.
I like to play tennis.
Again, yes. It's okay, let someone bring it around.
I watched her play tennis.
Okay, can you say that again?
I watched her play tennis.
I watched her play tennis. Okay. All right, now let me just give you a little bit of historical information. When my implant was first turned on in 2001, the software was set to give me 8 channels, even though I have 16 electrodes for complicated technical reasons. So what you've just heard is a pretty good rendition of what things sounded like to me on that first day. I'll play it again, 8 channels.
I like to play tennis.
About a year later, I got new software that upgraded me to 16 channels. How does that work? Well, in the body of the processor, when you take the battery off, there's a data input jack. So the audiologist can plug a computer into this and download a new version of the software into the processor. And the processor then sends some of that software into the implant. So I get software upgrades all the time. So back in 2002 or so, I was upgraded from 8 channels to 16 channels. So let me play 16 channels.
I like to play tennis.
Okay, who thinks that I'd like to play tennis? Okay, roughly 2/3. Who thinks that I'd like to play chess? Okay, roughly no thirds. Who thinks that I'd like to pay cash? Roughly no thirds. And who thinks that I learned how to pay cash? Something like that. Anyway, any guesses on that one? Okay. Now let me play the original unfiltered edition of the sound.
I like to play tennis.
Big difference, right? Listen to 16 again.
I like to play tennis.
Original.
I like to play tennis.
So there are two important things to draw from this. First, there's a big difference between what I hear and what most of you hear, especially with your 18 to 21-year-old ears, okay? There's a big difference between what Alexa and I and you hear and what the rest of you hear. And clearly, it's not as good, and this helps to answer your question. On the other hand, as ratty as it is, that is a usable signal. That is what allows me and Alexa to have conversations, to use the telephone, to listen to the radio. Now let me say, what I hear now is actually better than this. For two reasons. First of all, I've got two cochlear implants, so I'm getting input on both sides. And second, they're running software that effectively gives me 192 channels. They use very clever software tricks to make the ear think that there's 192 electrodes in the electrode array instead of just 16. So what I actually hear is quite a bit better than that 16-channel version, but not as good as the original. Now, if you are a philosophy student, you may be wondering, what do I hear when I listen to that 16-channel version? In other words, what does the simulation of a cochlear implant sound like to a cochlear implant user? I don't know. This is a subject for a philosophy student to write a master's thesis about. And I've been saying this in college audiences for years, waiting for somebody to take up the challenge. But I think it's really interesting that Alexa was able to pick it up on 4 channels. Almost nobody can do that, okay? But I think that maybe it's because Alexa's brain is used to decoding the output of a cochlear implant. So she got the 4-channel version. Let me just play again for you the 2-channel version. Now that you know what it says, I like to play tennis. See if you can hear it at 4 channels and 2 channels.
I like to play tennis.
Can you hear that now? In 2 channels. Now that's a lot harder. But even so, you're still getting some of the shape of the sentence. And that proves 2 things. First of all, it shows why even the users of the very earliest 1-channel cochlear implants got a lot of benefit out of them. As hideous as the signal was, they were able to combine it with lip reading and with context to figure out the sound. So the brain can make use of very low-resolution data and do a great deal with it. That's why cochlear implants work, not because they're $6 million man bionic ears, but because the brain is really good at making use of very poor data. Any questions at this point before we go on? Yes.
So I just wanted to add a comment. I'm Alexa's partner, and I can tell you that I think part of the reason she's so good at this stuff is because she was a hearing aid user for so long, and her hearing aids were substantially worse than her cochlear implants. So one of the things I think is an interesting question is, what's the difference between putting a cochlear implant into an adult who's never been a hearing aid user versus a cochlear implant into somebody who's been doing decoding work, albeit in a different context, for a long time?
That's a great point and a great question. So the point, to summarize, so you hypothesized that one reason Alexa could do so well is because you'd had a lifetime of experience hearing with hearing aids. So you were already good at listening to degraded sound. That's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. However, what's interesting is that when you look at the literature, the people who do best with cochlear implants are the ones who had normal hearing and then abruptly went deaf. because they have fully developed auditory cortexes. The brain is very sophisticated at dealing with sound. So I've heard people say that when they got their cochlear implants, things sounded normal. And when I hear that, I want to leap out of my chair and point at them and say, you can't say that sounds normal. It doesn't sound normal. But I've heard people with that history of normal hearing, abruptly going deaf, getting implants, say, it sounds great. How they get there, I don't know. The worst candidate is someone who has never heard, and they get an implant in their adult lives. After several decades of never hearing, the brain doesn't know how to hear. It just doesn't know how to decode that input. And generally, that's a very poor prognosis. What they get, which is important, is awareness of sound. So many culturally deaf people, that is people who are primarily signers, have gotten implants, not because they want to use the telephone or join the English-speaking world, but because they want to hear their kids crying. They want to hear somebody knocking at the door. They want to hear the dog barking. They want to be alerted when something is going on. And so since that is their expectation, they're perfectly satisfied with that outcome. So there's a whole range of outcomes and a whole range of expectations. So that was a great point. Yes?
I got a cochlear implant because of Lex. So your book watered down to her, then me 6 months later. But I just want to clarify, after 5 years, my brain thinks speech sounds like the hearing aids I wore till I was 56. So I don't know that weird sound is going on in my brain. It sounds normal to what I know from hearing aids, which is an amplification. So it's not robotic. I don't know if it's clear to people that your demonstration is happening in our heads, but that's not what we're hearing speech almost normally.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that you hear better with the cochlear implant than you did with hearing aids, correct?
Yeah, but it's the same.
And it sounds the same thing.
Yeah.
Pitches sound the same, voices sound the same. That's amazing. I can't explain that. To me, voices sounded very different. But that really shows that different people have very profoundly different experiences.
Yeah, I don't know why. I did lose my hearing earlier, but I don't know why. It would sound different to me.
Well, as you point out, everybody has a different hearing history. And for that reason, they react to cochlear implants differently. There's a great saying, no two deaf people are deaf in the same way. Every deaf person is deaf in a different way, and that's really very true. Any other questions or points before we go on? So we're wrapping up here in Cochlear Implant 101. Okay, onward. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about the sociological side of this technology. And the point I'm making here is that cyborg technologies don't just have an impact on the individual. They also have an impact on the society in which people live. Here's an example. This is an old piece of data. North Carolina is one of the few states that actually track whether students are in sign language programs or mainstreamed in spoken language programs. So in 1995, 40% of the kids in North Carolina, the deaf kids, were in auditory oral programs, which mostly meant that they went to school with their hearing peers. The other 60% were in sign language only programs, often residential schools, where the primary language was sign. That was in 1995. Just 10 years later, look how much had changed. 10 years later, a much smaller percentage of the students, about 15%, were in sign programs. The other 85% were in oral programs. So in just 10 years, the way deaf people were educated in North Carolina changed dramatically. Now, there are several reasons for that, including the way the laws function, but certainly one influence is cochlear implants. Because when you give a cochlear implant to a very young deaf child, 6 months of age, a year of age, their trajectory of learning language is essentially normal. It's usually slightly delayed, but in most children it's close to normal, which means that they don't need to go into sign language programs, which is having a huge impact on the demographics of the signing deaf community. So there's a paper that was published about this issue back in 2006. This was just focusing on Australia, which has a policy of issuing cochlear implants to deaf children. It's done automatically. If you're born deaf in Australia, the state gives you a cochlear implant. Boom, it's just the way they do it. What is happening is predictable. So to read here, the negative impact of the cochlear implant program on the signing deaf, on the future growth of the signing deaf community in Australia must be deemed to be significant, irreversible, and well underway. And we are seeing the same kinds of things happening in other parts of the world, in Europe, in the United States. And there are, of course, a wide range of opinions on this. Some people think this is catastrophic. Other people think this is great. This is medical progress at work. In point of questions, I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular issue, but I wanted to point it out before going on. Any thoughts or questions about this? Yes. Can you have the mic over here, please?
Hi. So the percentages that you've just put up, the shift to 85% of North Carolina's school children, is this solely due to cochlear implants? In other words, who pays for those? They're $50,000 a pop, right?
More than that. So the question is that change solely due to cochlear implants? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. I do know that many states passed laws during that time period mandating that children, whenever possible, be educated with their peers. So the legal environment did change. So cochlear implants are one influence, but not the only one.
Would it be fair to maybe take a more cynical view, given that it's North Carolina, and there's eroding support for any kind of public programs in North Carolina? Would it be fair to take a more cynical view and maybe think that ASL itself is deemed too expensive as a form of instruction, and that students who might have been slotted for ASL instruction are simply being placed with an aide or something in regular education classrooms?
That's a very good point. So the question is, could it be that the governments think it's simply too expensive to raise children using sign language only programs? And you're absolutely right. It is very expensive to be deaf. Because if you spend a lifetime needing interpreters in special schools, that adds up to an astronomical amount of money over a lifetime. So it could absolutely be a decision by legislators. It is cheaper to give a child a cochlear implant. They cost $50,000 a pop, okay? 2 of them, $100,000. It's still cheaper to do that than to spend a lifetime educating a child in a language that is not English. So I think your instinct is probably correct on that.
Thank you.
Any more points? Yes, sir. Can you give a microphone to that man?
Yeah, I apologize for not asking sooner. It was actually a little bit related to using the technology now in place of the natural cilia and the cochlea, as you explained. Just one question that came to mind is usually when we start to make something artificial, you gain some benefit, but sometimes at a trade-off or at a cost. So I'm assuming that there has been maybe some work on long-term studies in terms of what are the effects biologically, because you're not using the cilia, which is the natural way to obtain, as you showed in your demonstration, the quality of the sound changes as well. Are there any known negative effects biologically to stimulating the neurons electrically, or is that actually, it turns out to be no difference at all and there is no harm at all as a cost kind of aspect to it?
Okay, it's a good question. The question is, does a cochlear implant damage the structures of the ear? To my knowledge, the answer is no. I know many people who have been implanted since they were infants. They're now in law school, okay? And their implants are working fine. My implants seem to be working just as well now, better really, than they were in 2001. And that's been 13 years. So there's a long medical history of these devices functioning safely and effectively over extended periods of time. So I'm not aware of any long-term negative effect, either from the technology itself or from the nature of the electrical stimulation. It's a fair question, but I'm not aware of any negative side effects. Okay, one more question if anyone has one, then we'll go on.
I do. Maybe this is two questions. Is this fully covered by insurance? Is it fully covered? Okay. And I know recently I watched a YouTube video, something was on Facebook, about I think an 8-week-old getting cochlear implants. It was amazing. But is this something that grows within the lifetime? So if an 8-week-old gets cochlear implants, lifetime doesn't have to be redone or anything like that?
Great question. Okay, so let's take the two questions.
Okay.
So the first question is it covered by insurance? The answer is usually yes. Okay. My first cochlear implant in my left ear was covered, no question, no problem. Getting the second one was much more difficult. It took me and a team of 3 lawyers a year and a half to persuade my insurer to cover the second implant, because they believed that if, as long as you can hear in one ear, it doesn't need to pay the extra for the other ear. That is now changing. It is becoming called the standard of care to have both ears implanted, because there is an increasing amount of data showing that when children grow bilateral, they do much better, because the brain is designed to get sound from both sides, and it does better when it gets sound from both sides. Now, to your other question, let's come back to that diagram. So you're wondering, so you put all that hardware inside the brain of an 8-week-old child, what happens when the kid's 40? Okay, amazing but true. The cochlea is one of the few parts of the body whose size does not change. Okay, it's like the ear was designed to have cochlear implants put in it. Okay, so the cochlea itself, it remains absolutely stable. What surgeons will do in young children is they will put some slack in that cord, so that as the skull gets thicker, the slack just gets taken up. So the cochlear implant that goes in at 8 weeks is still functioning when the kid is 20, 25 years old. So I wondered the same thing too, and it turned out it's not a problem. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so now let's get into part 2. So I have demonstrated to you that you can put a bunch of electrodes inside an ear and make a brain believe that it's hearing. This is what I hear. I'm totally deaf. I have no biological hearing whatsoever. And yet, I heard your questions. I hear my own voice. This is all because of electrodes firing into the nerve endings inside my inner ear. So you can use a computer to make a brain think it is experiencing an auditory world. The question is, how much further can that go? Well, let's talk about it. So let's talk about some interesting research that is going on in trying to create devices that supplant body functions. So this video, and by the way, all the videos I'm about to show you have no sound, okay? So there's nothing to listen for. They're silent. I will narrate. What you're going to see in this video is a man who was a telephone lineman who was in a really bad place at the wrong time. He was at the top of a telephone pole when he was electrocuted. And as a consequence, he lost both arms at the shoulder. Okay? It's a very sad story. And of course, people are trying to do what they can for him. So this is a prosthetic arm that is using electrodes. You can see them back here on his back. What surgeons did was they took the remaining nerves in his stump and they physically moved those nerves to different parts of his back and I think his chest as well. So for example, when you move your elbow, there's a certain nerve that controls that elbow. What they did was they took that nerve and they relocated it in the back so that when the person tries to move their elbow, that part of the back will jump. The muscle will shudder because the nerve is making it move. So the muscle itself actually twitches. the electrode picks up that twitch, and the software figures out, okay, that electrode picked up a twitch, that corresponds to the closing of the elbow, so I'm going to make the prosthetic arm close its elbow. Okay, everybody see what's going on here? All right, so let's see how well this works. So this is all happening because as he imagines his arm doing these things, muscles in his back twitch, those electrodes pick it up, make the arm do it. Now, the question is, well, there's two things. I find these videos, they're both amazing and underwhelming. Okay. Notice for one thing, they're wearing goggles. Okay. There's a good reason for that, because they can't entirely control where the thing goes. And notice also that while it works, it's slow. It doesn't work as well as a natural arm. I'm not trying to diss this video. Okay, it is absolutely astounding. But it shows both how far we have come, but how far we still have to go in creating a fully articulated prosthetic arm. And I also understand that I've actually talked to some people that have arms like this. They have to really think while they're doing it, because they can't get the arm to do two things simultaneously. If you want to pick something up, they first have to move the elbow, then move the wrist, then move the finger, one thing at a time. It's very difficult to get three motions simultaneously. So they really have to stop and think about how they take apart the action. Another crucial issue is that they can send signals to the arm, but the arm can't send signals back to the brain. So they only know where the limb is by looking at it. So they always have to watch the thing in order to get feedback on where the arm is. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is. Think about when you eat. You don't watch your fork to see where it is. You just know. It's called proprioception. And that lack of proprioception is one of the biggest challenges in creating a Luke Skywalker kind of arm. Now, what this shows you is that you can gather enough data from the skin, from the nervous system, to control a prosthetic arm. What else can you do? Let's go on. So I wrote a story about this. This came out in Wired in April 2012. You can actually look it up. It's called Waiting for the Bionic Man. So I wrote a story on these prosthetic limbs. And I really tried to challenge the assumption made by people that, oh, this is right around the corner. In a couple of years, they'll just issue everybody without an arm or leg one of these things. No, not so. It's a long, hard struggle to make a truly functional prosthetic limb. Now, here's an interesting example of reading a mind. This is not a video. I can't show you a video of this. But this is me at the Society for Neuroscience in, I think, 2011. And there's this cap that they were putting on people. They would stare at the computer screen, which had a bunch of letters on it, and letters would appear one after another. It looked like magic, okay? Like, oh my God, the computer must be reading the mind, otherwise how would it know what the person was trying to say? But then when I tried it myself, I realized that there's a kind of a trick to it. And here's the way it works. The screen flashes the letters, it's like A, B, C, D, E, down to Z. It flashes each letter on and off very rapidly, several times a second. You look at the letter that you want to spell. So you focus on that part of the screen. And then when that letter flashes, like the H, for example, it makes your visual cortex do a kind of a ping. Certain nerves just fire. And the electrodes in the back of the cap, they pick that up. It's the visual system reacting to that letter lighting up. So when it sees the visual system go, oh, something just happens, it figures out, okay, what letter was that? And it puts it on the screen. So what you do is you use your eye to look at each letter, and then that letter appears on the screen. So that was what I spelled out, and I did it on the first try, I have to say. It took no practice. But it made me realize that, again, it's both impressive and underwhelming. You realize the computer doesn't know what your brain is thinking. It doesn't know that your brain is thinking hello out there. It doesn't even know that your brain is thinking H-E-L and so forth. All it knows is that your visual system has seen something. That's it. So this is kind of the story that you see over and over again in today's bionics. It's both impressive and underwhelming. Okay. Now, this is a video of someone who is completely paralyzed. She has no volitional control over her body. Let me start the video. So this is at Brown University. This is a woman who is completely paralyzed, and she has a chip implanted in her motor cortex. It's a little bit like a cochlear implant. And that is the plug that is actually reading data out of the neurons that are firing in her motor cortex. So in this case, instead of putting electrodes on the skin, they're putting the electrodes directly in the brain itself. So she is attempting to move this robotic arm. I think the video froze. She's attempting to move that robotic arm to pick up the drink. So let me just go back and start this up again. It's probably a little slow because it's trying to read it from my flash drive. Okay, so she is imagining herself moving her hand, which no longer works, to pick up. So let me see if I can. Can you just jump in and play the video directly natively? Can you just help me get to the flash drive and do that? There we go. It's called Want to Drink from Bottom. Yeah, I'm just going to play the video natively. That should work better. Okay, that should work better. Sorry, I didn't realize this would be so complicated. But while you guys figure that out, I'll keep talking. Okay, so what you're seeing, so for one thing, she had no volitional control over her body for years and years. So she is one of the first people to be implanted with the system. It's called the brain gate. So her effort there is to reach out and pick the thing up. So I didn't realize it was so complicated to ask them to play it natively. Let's see how this works out. Technology. While they're working on that, does anybody have any questions? We can tackle a question. Does anybody have any questions about cochlear implants, about this technology before we go on? Let's see how that works. Okay, there we go. That looks good. The bottle has coffee in it, by the way. And you can see here in the lower left-hand corner the computer's simulation of what it thinks it's doing. And you can see how much she's concentrating. So this is not an easy task for her. The next challenge is to turn the wrist. having to work on. You can see she actually doesn't have the coffee pulling through. You got it? Now, of course, she's got to put it down again. Okay, that's good. Can you stop it, Alexa, and bring back the PowerPoint? So thank you. Yes. Oh, can we get that microphone over there? Yeah, I can grab it. This is fine.
Like a two-part process. I'm thinking of picking it up and then turning. So while she's doing that, does she also need to think about holding it in the air while she's drinking the straw as well?
I believe so.
That's impressive. I mean, that's really
grasp.
impressive.
So maybe that once it grasps, I don't know the deep details of this.
Okay.
But once it grasps, it's done.
It's
the only
done?
thing you
Okay.
have to do next is to let go, to open it up.
Okay. Wow. Really cool.
Any other questions? So this comes back to my point. I mean, it's a beautiful video, and it's moving, and it's truly impressive because it shows that from reading from about 100 neurons in the motor cortex of the brain, they were able to figure out what her intention was, what her brain wanted to do. It was able to decode the neural activity of the neurons themselves as they fired. It was really directly reading her brain activity and understanding what it meant. And you can see it worked. But you can also see it was very slow and awkward. It's clearly not ready for prime time, and it's even more not ready to be actually implanted in a person. One of the biggest difficulties with any kind of prosthetic device is that you can make it work, but you got to strap the thing on. It's very difficult to plug it into the bone in such a way that it stays there. So if you think back to the $6 Million Man, to other kind of science fiction figures, you have to think, how did they do the osseointegration? How did they get it to get in the bone and stay there? That's really, really, really hard to do. But the triumph here is in reading the neural signal. So let's see how much further we can go with that. So I wrote another story. This came out in Wired. I forget when. God, I'm trying to forget my own stories. But there's a problem with electricity, okay? It's a problem with cochlear implants. With a cochlear implant, when you fire an electrode inside the cochlea, that electricity spreads because the inside of the body is a wet, salty environment. It's really tough to control electricity. It works, the problem is the other way around too. If you put an electrode inside the brain and a neuron fires, it's very difficult to figure out which neuron is actually firing. Is it this one? Is it that one? Is it this one over here? That's just the beginning of the problem. So researchers are trying to figure out more sophisticated ways to read brain activity and to control brain activity. So I just want to give you a little heads up on a new technique that's been developed that's really very exciting. What's interesting is that when I started writing my book, Worldwide Mind, in 2008, the technology didn't exist. And by 2010, when I was actively writing the book, the technology had come into existence, and I was scrambling to keep up with it. So I was stuck with happening even as I was writing a book about it. So the deal with optogenetics is that you are using light to make neurons fire or stop firing. Now that sounds insane at first, right? What do you mean light? How do you get light to control something that's in the brain? Well, think about something. What does respond to light? Plants. We all know when you put a plant in the sunlight, it will track the sun through the sky. The leaves will turn. The plants are somehow able to know where the light is and respond to it. Well, amazingly enough, you can take the gene responsible for that activity out of a plant, okay, and put it into a mammalian neuron. the neuron will use that gene, and it will fire or stop firing when it sees light. So you can actually genetically modify neurons inside the brain with genes from plants to make them light sensitive. That's called optogenetics. So to give you sort of the super basic version, you can set it up so that when you fire blue light at neurons, that'll make the neurons fire. And then when you fire yellow light at them, that will make them stop firing. So with two different colors, you can either make neurons fire or inhibit them from firing. Now, the technique can be made incredibly precise. So you can fire only one type of neuron. The brain has dozens of different kinds of neurons. So in the motor cortex, for example, that is the part of the brain that controls the body, there are neurons that are devoted to motor activity. There are also neurons that are devoted to all sorts of other things that have nothing to do with the motor system. Wouldn't it be great if you could get a system in there that would only pay attention to the motor neurons and ignore all the other neurons? You can't do that with electricity, but you can do it with optogenetics. And also, you can make the effect very localized to say, just within this cubic millimeter, pay attention to those neurons, ignore all the others. And the most exciting of all, you can potentially activate and identify groups of neurons. So think about this. Let's say that you see laser pointer, okay? How do you know that it's a laser pointer? The image of the laser pointer is falling on your retina. Some kind of processing of that image is going into your visual cortex, and your brain is effortlessly identifying it as a laser pointer. How does that happen? Well, that is one of the deep mysteries of neuroscience. People are spending entire careers figuring that out. But at least one thing is believed to be so. When you see a laser pointer, a certain set of neurons in your brain will fire, or maybe stop firing, some kind of activity. But there's some set of neurons, like neuron 18, neuron 24, neuron 4011, neuron 3,016,000. Those four neurons predictably fire when you see a laser pointer. And if you can figure that out, then when you see those four neurons fire, you can reasonably infer that the brain is seeing a laser pointer. Now, that's a super simplified version, okay, but that's to give you the idea. You could go the other way around. If you could just fire neurons 18, 24, 3011, and 4,016,000, and only those neurons, you might be able to give the brain the belief that it is seeing a laser pointer. Now, as crazy as that sounds, that's pretty much what my cochlear implant is doing for me right now. It knows that when it fires electrode 3, electrode 7, and electrode 9 in just such a way that I hear a high-pitched sound, or I hear the word Michael, or hey you, or stop that, or whatever. The breaking down of neural activity into, you fire these neurons, the brain will have this experience. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the basic idea that researchers are trying to tease out. And what I'm trying to do is to figure out how far can that go. So I'm going to show you a video now. I'm actually going to show it to you twice. Because the first time you see it, you're going to think, this is really dull. This is just a mouse running around in a circle. That's what you're going to see. You're going to see a mouse running around in a counterclockwise circle. And hopefully this video will play a little fast. Let's just try playing the video, Alexa. Let's see if it works natively, because it's a much simpler video. Okay, so you see a mouse. What you can't really see in the video is that there's a fiber optic cable hanging down from above that terminates in the mouse's brain. Okay, it's hanging down, and it is shining blue light. You can actually see the blue light into the mouse's brain. And while that blue light is on, the mouse runs around in a circle. Okay, what's the big deal? All right, let's play it again. Could you play it again for me, Alexa? Yeah, this mouse's motor cortex has been optogenetically modified, so that its neurons will fire when it sees a blue light. Even more specifically, the neurons that control the arm and the leg on one side of the body will activate when that blue light goes on, not the neurons that control the other side of the body. Now think about it for a minute. If you're a four-legged creature, and these two arms and legs go, what's going to happen? Well, you see it, right? It's going around in a circle because only one set of arms and legs is moving. That's what you're seeing going on here. Now, could you go ahead and play that a third time, actually, so we can see it in more detail? Okay, now first, the blue light is not on. So right now, there's no blue light. So the mouse is just kind of doing its mousy thing. Watch carefully. Blue light goes on. Now it starts running around in a circle. That's because the optogenetic stuff is doing its business. Now the light turns off in a second. Watch carefully. It stops. The mouse just sort of stops and looks up. What just happened? Why did I just do that? So this is an example of putting an optogenetic inside a mouse's genetically modified brain so that when you fire it, the mouse does one thing. It does one specific activity. It runs around in a counterclockwise circle. It doesn't twitch. It doesn't fall over. It doesn't start reciting encyclopedias. It doesn't scratch its butt. It does one and only one thing. So these are early demonstrations that the technology is getting good enough so that you can fire only a specific set of neurons to evoke one specific activity. Everybody with me so far? Now, let's spin this out a little bit, okay? And this is where I begin to get wildly speculative. But this is what I do, okay? I'm a writer. I speculate for a living. So there's interesting papers coming out, neural encoding of the concept of nest in the mouse's brain. So neuroscientists are beginning to untangle what the rules are. What specific tangle of neurons fires when a mouse sees its nest? And then, theoretically, if you can make those neurons fire, the mouse would feel, oh, my nest is here. It's right around here somewhere. And here's another paper, optogenetic stimulation of the auditory pathway. And this is about using that same kind of technology, maybe someday to replace cochlear implants. Because as you know, when you asked your question, I said to you, take those 12,500 hair cells, replace them with 16 electrodes, you're going to lose a little something, as you can hear. But the idea is if you could replace that with an optogenetic system, you don't have to mess around with electricity anymore. You use light, which is much more precise. You might get a much better cochlear implant. Okay, so now we're starting to see papers like a brain-to-brain interface for real-time sharing of sensory motor information. Okay, this was PLOS One back in 2012. Okay, so that title takes some thinking. Okay, what is this actually saying? Well, it's actually saying that you have a brain-to-brain interface, one creature's brain to another creature's brain, for real-time sharing of information about the senses. In other words, when one brain feels something, the other brain will feel something like that. Okay? So let's take a look at what actually happened here. You know, when I first saw this paper, I thought, well, wait a minute, this doesn't sound very complicated. This is what I thought happened. So you have two mice, okay? Both mice had brain implants in their brains, and one mouse, the implant is picking up its neural activity, and the other mouse, the electrode array, is making neural activity happen, okay? So you're taking neural data out of this little fellow's brain, and you're putting the same neural data into this little fellow's brain. And the question is, what happens, okay? Will this mouse's actions also be executed by this mouse? That's the question. So here's what I thought it was all about. This mouse presses a left or right bar. A simple signal, either some vague feeling or a different vague feeling. And this mouse learns that this vague feeling means left, this vague feeling means right. Okay? If that was the case, it really would not be very impressive. Because anybody can sort of learn that vague feeling number one means this, vague feeling number two means this. Okay? That's not very interesting. But that's not what happened. This is what happened. So the sender mouse pressed the left or the right bar. Okay? That's the initiating action. That activity is recorded and processed. By process means basically cleaning it up a little bit, trying to extract the essence of the signal. a version of that data is sent to the receiver's brain. So it's not a vague feeling. It's attempting to figure out which neurons actually fired. Did the neurons that correspond to the right side being pressed or the left side being pressed? Which one? But it's not saying, the system itself isn't saying, oh, this means left, that means right. It's taking the actual neural firing itself. And this mess is figuring out, or rather, it's probably getting some impression, oh, I must now press this left button, okay? Because something makes me want to do it. And now, oh, now I really want to press the right button because it's receiving that signal without knowing it from the sender mouse. That's what's really going on. So it is an actual kind of brain-to-brain telepathy, albeit in a very limited sense, okay? It's not mind reading, but it's a step in that direction. I just want to point out the success rate was 60 to 72%. If it was just at random, you get a success rate of 50%, okay? So it's still well short of 100%. But I'm building up an argument here. The argument that I'm building up is that it's becoming thinkable to pull signals out of one brain, send those signals to another brain, and have the receiver brain experience an intelligible percept. Something, it feels that something is going on. Everybody with me so far? Now, what could you do with this? Well, first of all, just kind of ask a few basic questions. Okay? I don't know the answers to these questions yet. I would like to find out. Do the rats think they're communicating? Or do they think they're just pressing levers? I mean, what do the rats think is going on? We can't ask the rats, so we don't know. And does the receiver rat feel that it's responding to a learned signal, or is it actually being forced to press the bar? Is it acting as if its own brain is generating that activity? My hunch is that it's the second, that the brain is doing what it would ordinarily do. It just suddenly feels an overwhelming, compelling need to press the left bar. Just like that mouse you saw running in the clockwise circle, counterclockwise. It didn't know why. It just suddenly felt this overwhelming need. Oh, I must now run in a counterclockwise circle. Okay? All right. So if you read the article, you get these mind-blowing kind of sentences. In theory, channel accuracy can be increased if instead of a dyad, a pair, you can have a whole grid of multiply reciprocally interconnected brains. Well, could you do this? Could you link a whole bunch of brains together? Okay. So in my book, Worldwide Mind, I try to imagine what this could be like. So you might have a person see an apple. Certain neurons will fire in their brain. That activity gets picked up by some implanted device. And then a signal gets sent over the internet to a receiver's brain. And it fires the neurons and makes the receiver have the same perception. So you suddenly think, oh, I'm seeing an apple. Or, maybe a little more accurately, somebody else is sending me the sensation that they're seeing an apple. All right? This is what I called telepathy. At this point, you're probably starting to think back to the question that I opened this lecture with. Why? Why do this? Why bother? Well, let's talk about that. So, one disclaimer, first of all. I don't want to imply that this is around the corner, okay? Because you need a couple things. We still don't know how to distinguish groups of neurons from each other. We still don't. I think you also need a shared communicative concept. I think the idea of just telepathy, just knowing where another mind is thinking, is probably not possible for complicated reasons. But if you're in the same context, where you're in the same place thinking about the same things, you might know if the other person is feeling pain. You might know which of their arms and legs are moving. You might know what they're looking at. You might know what they're paying attention to. The question is, how would that be useful? Well, think about some close-knit people like a military group, where it would be very important and very helpful to know what else is going on with the other people in that team. Is somebody in pain? You want to know that right away, because it helps you figure out, is there a threat coming from a certain quarter? You know, I mean, today, you hear a grunt, and you surmise that something really bad has happened, but you don't know what it is. We're trying to imagine scenarios in which this kind of information, this kind of sensory impression that something's happened, that you're feeling something, would be of communicative importance in a way that now we can only begin to imagine. This is what I call telepathy. Today it sounds like nonsense, just as email sounded like nonsense back in 1990 or so. Okay, so to begin wrapping up, it does sound like a crazy idea, right? But I do want to point out that in 1975, cochlear implants were crazy ideas. And they really were. Surgeons were incredibly skeptical. People said, you'll never be able to get enough electrodes in there. You'll never be able to get enough computing power in there. No brain will ever be able to understand the signal. It'll never work. Don't bother. Forget it. Fortunately, some people did bother and did develop the technology. Okay, and that concludes. So thank you all so much for listening to my research and my thoughts. Thank you all. Okay, we have a little time for some questions and answers. So, yes, sir. Let me also add, it's been an hour and a half. You need to go. Please feel free. Okay, yes, sir. Could you get the mic up there? And also, please feel free to talk about this on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle name. Yes, sir.
So many of the latest kind of advancements in, say, human prosthetics or even the optogenetics seem obviously really interesting with some interesting applications, but there are also some ways in my mind in which they seem a little sketchy in terms of the ethics, especially, say, having mice run around in circles because they're essentially being stimulated by one particular kind of light. And so I guess what I'm really curious about is how you see the ethical kind of considerations playing out against the potential advancements coming from what could be really amazing scientific kind of discoveries and progress. How do you think that we can balance against those, even security risks in some senses? Perhaps these devices would be hacked, right? How can we kind of balance those needs?
Indeed, you've asked a fantastic question. The technology obviously raises alarming issues of control, right? Because you've just seen a mouse being controlled to do something. You've just seen a mouse being made to act, not because you persuaded it, but because you're forcing its brain to do it. And that seems alarming because we think the brain as the very seat of our own identity. The brain is us. If you can make it do something by external agency, that would seem very threatening to the integrity of the person, the privacy of the mind. So this is a very profound question that you ask. So without minimizing the alarming possibilities, okay, I want to point out that every new technology has alarming possibilities, right? Plato, 2,400 years ago. People now are still agonizing about the internet. There's a whole tide of books coming out saying, Google is making us dumber. Maybe it's true and maybe it isn't. But I just want to point out to start with, every new technology is a double-edged sword. Fire can cook your food. It can also burn down your house. This is in the same vein. So an important point I want to make is that just because something is alarming and potentially dangerous doesn't mean that we should automatically not consider using it. Okay, now, having said that, the possibilities are obviously alarming. The analogy that works best for me is thinking about things like Facebook. Facebook has really reconfigured the way privacy works in our society. Now, everybody can put out stuff about themselves. And of course, you've probably read stuff in the papers about people putting embarrassing stuff about themselves on Facebook that they only intended their friends to read, that somehow slipped out to the entire world. Okay? And these are problems. I mean, we have problems with sexting, where people send, erotic pictures that were only intended for one person, but somehow slip out and the entire world gets to see them. So we are struggling right now with these issues of privacy and security and the integrity of the personhood. I think that the answer would be similar to the set of answers that I think we're beginning to develop for Facebook. One is to make sure that people know how to use the privacy controls so that you can set something up so that only your friends get to see this, okay, and nobody else. And so you could set up some similar system with your own brain to say, Well, only my girlfriend, my wife, and my brother get to know what I'm feeling and thinking. Nobody else. You have to implement the appropriate protocols to try to make that stick. Is that always going to work? Well, no. The inherent nature of anything digital is that it is infinitely copyable and infinitely repeatable. And we deal with this danger not just in the vague future, but every single day of our lives. Anybody who has hit reply all by mistake has already had that problem. So my answer is neither that, oh, it's not a problem, nor that this is an Orwellian technology that will make us all robots. But just real life will happen again. A new and powerful set of technologies will produce problems and missteps, but also produce substantial and important benefits. And society will generally agree that the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. To wrap up, just think about automobiles. Imagine if the first people who invented an automobile had to file an impact statement that said 45,000 people a year will be killed in this country because of this technology. Well, that's true, isn't it? But we still use automobiles because we consider the benefit to outweigh the negative impact. And I think that is the way it would go. Do you have any response to that? Do you want to follow up on that?
I think the main issue that differentiates and makes this, in my mind, a little bit more apples and oranges than it seems you're admitting in the answer there, is that this is fundamentally about human agency and kind of power over biology. Facebook is not precisely power over biology. It seems like there is a distinct kind of step there, right, that says, hey, this is kind of a different, new kind of way that, honestly, every person in this room would not have access to even combating potential abuses, right? Like these are high-level government research, DARPA, right? And so I think, in my mind at least, there is a concern about the public nature of these technologies being implemented, but also kind of the biological nature and the scientific nature that draws a distinction between privacy controls on Facebook and mass production of prosthetic limbs through DARPA, right? So at least in my mind, there's a bit of a difference. But I think, obviously, Plato and the Phaedrus with Socrates talking about writing, right? We've learned those lessons time and time again. Certainly, it seems to me solvable. But I guess I'm concerned about how we would solve that. Not that this technology is inherently unethical, but in fact, how would we get over those ethical hurdles?
Mm-hmm. I certainly agree with you that power over biology is a very significant degree of power. Let me point out, the reason I heard your question was power over biology. Okay, so for me, power over biology is a very definite benefit. I can only repeat my previous point that the benefits you get from a new technology are common in proportion to the dangers. The greater the danger, the greater the benefit. Fire is a very profound power over biology. It is incredibly devastating, but it's also incredibly useful. And you really cannot separate the two. All right, Henri, sir. Okay, first her, then you.
Yes, as far as, I wonder if you could address, I read your book, the first one, about how a disability will tear your complete soul, not just your body down. And any kind of research, I'm for it because cochlear implants are amazing. I don't know if you can address that. As a person with a disability, your interaction with humankind, your job, it's just so worth it.
Okay, I'm honestly not sure if I've understood your question. Could you run that by me again?
Well, if you could just show the value of going into things that might have a moral, ethical problem to people with disabilities, could you express that value to yourself?
Well, you raise an interesting point, because generally the first beneficiaries of these new kind of powers of biology are people with disabilities. So the man who had lost both arms, the woman who was completely paralyzed, they're on the front lines, not because they might have wanted that, but because they're in a desperate situation where a drastic intervention is deemed to be worth the risk. Same in my case. I would not have consented to ear surgery if I did not consider the benefit to be worth the risk. But the first proving ground for such technologies does tend to be disabled people, because that's where the first need is. So that is why generally the first application of such technologies. Sir.
Yeah, and in line with the idea of augmenting man with the artificials, we are dealing with the sciences of the artificial. So there's another camp in like the AI community and computational intelligence. You may have heard of Kurzweil and the Singularity University. So you were talking earlier, I can't quite recall, but do you think, I guess my question first off is, do you think that there are any inherent limitations, ultimate limitations or bottlenecks that we cannot completely, for example, the Singularity is saying that eventually we will be able to digitize the mind and we will be able to become one with technology and shed our biological nature and limitations that come with being an animal and instead become this digital, cybernetic, robotic, pure entity of something else. So you were talking about the mysteries of neuroscience, and yes, the problems are hard. Do you think that ultimately that these are all things that we can break through, or do you think that there are some aspects of the mind that we can never truly get at? And that can also be a philosophically bent question, depending on your views on consciousness. But
yes, you raise a fascinating set of questions. So let's start with the question of uploading. Okay, which is a bit different than the singularity issue. The question is, can you precisely characterize the status of every single neuron in a brain well enough to make that mind continue to function in a completely different substrate, like silicon? Okay, is that possible? And I'm of two minds about that. Okay, on the one hand, I am skeptical, and let me say why. People like Kurzweil, they tend to assume that neurons are just simple switches, that they just have an on state and an off state. And that is certainly true. But that underestimates the incredible complexity of the molecular interactions within the cell that control what it do. And I'm not convinced that just by modeling things on the level of neurons that you can actually model a whole brain. I think it may also be necessary to model the biochemistry that's going on within the neurons. And that is probably several orders of magnitude more complex than just trying to follow the 86 billion neurons in a brain. So not only do you have to model 86 billion neurons, you also have to model the literally millions of biochemical interactions taking place in the membrane, in the cytoplasm of those neurons. If that's the case, uploading is a long, long way away. Okay. So I am skeptical of the assumption that what we think of as consciousness can be reduced to the level of neurofiring. That if you capture that, you've captured the whole thing. I just am not convinced that that is the case. That there will be other layers of things that we're going to need to capture as well. The question is, can we capture them? Because the brain, it doesn't just sort of sit there and compute. It's very involved in a world that's going on. And neurons don't just fire in response to other neurons. They also fire in response to hormones. Oxytocin, you have a whole flood of chemical information systems going on in the brain, which are not digital. They're entirely analog. The release of oxytocin, the release of serotonin, the release of, a whole bunch of different things. You would have to model that as well. But those things are caused not just by what's going on in the brain, but what's going on in the body as well. So that pushes out the challenge even more. Maybe you can't just model the brain, you also have to model the body and the entire environment in which the body is situated. Wow, okay, it makes me think that the easier way to do that is to just have a body, all right? So I find the whole uploading scenario just not particularly believable. What I think is more plausible, and I talked about this in my book, Worldwide Mind, by the way. I make the point that the future isn't just what we have now, only bigger and faster, okay? That's fundamentally different from what we have now. So I think that what's more plausible, instead of things like uploading and singularities in which computers suddenly become intelligent and then undergo a process of runaway acceleration, okay, these are futures we can imagine where what we have now just gets better and faster. I think what's more likely is going to be stuff that we don't expect. And I think one possibility is that when you can get enough information out of a brain to allow a new kind of communication with another brain, then you may get kinds of system interactions where you have a whole society communicating in terms of emotions. It might not be crazy in 20 years to know how Canada is feeling, for example. Okay? Today, that's a crazy thing to say. But in 20 or 30 years, we might be able to get enough information from enough people to be able to summarize what the emotional mood of a large group of people is, and to use that information then to feed back into the system. So, for example, if a group of people in a city are very happy about something, this system would allow you to realize that that's going on and to try different things just to see what the outcome is. And I'm talking very vaguely, obviously. Just as somebody would have talked really vaguely about email in the 1990s, well, you might memorize and they would get there faster, but that level of analysis just doesn't get into how profoundly email actually affected society. But I think that those are the more plausible outcomes, the stuff we don't see coming. Singularity uploading, I don't see that happening. I see other stuff happening instead. Okay. Sorry, what's that?
Politicians would really like that.
Yes.
Like how a city felt.
Yes. Well, I'd like to point out they're actually using it now. Okay, so for example, companies like Twitter, they take the summated information and they do what they call sentiment analysis. They can actually find information like how are people feeling about the Red Sox. That information is very valuable to the Red Sox. And Twitter is making a great deal of money trying to extract information out of these billions of little tweets that go out and seeing what the big patterns are. They're doing big data on Twitter, and they're selling the outcomes of that data to interested parties, governments, corporations, and so forth. So that's not the future. That's now. That's already happening. Okay, another question, comment. Yes, sir.
So I came a little bit late, so I apologize if you went into this as well. So I was very fascinated with the slide, maybe 2 slides before this one, that showed the transfer of information from one brain to another.
Let me just bring that slide up.
Yes.
That may help. Okay.
Yes, that's one. So my question was, I'm thinking about now individuals with vision impairment who cannot access information visually. Would something like this be put on a table for the future? And again, I don't know how that would look. Again, this is something that we're talking very way out there. But as technology grows, and I'm thinking about this because we are seeing students who are visually impaired entering the fields of engineering. And engineering by itself is a very visual program, a very visual subject. But would stuff like this have an impact for those kind of students?
It's possible. I should first point out there is research going on in creating retinal implants where you put electrodes on the retina itself and stimulate it to try to send information electrically to the visual cortex. It's the same idea as a cochlear implant. It's much harder to do because the retina is very delicate. But what you're asking about is a little more complicated. What you're asking about is, can you take processed visual information out of the brain of someone who is seeing and send that same information into the brain of someone who is blind and get them to see the same things that the sender is seeing? I don't see why not. In fact, there's been some interesting experiments in mice and rats in doing something that's kind of like that, and taking signals out of the visual cortex and sending the same signals into another rat and seeing if it behaves as if it's seen that object. Okay, so stuff like this actually is beginning to happen in labs. In principle, I don't see why not. In practice, of course, vision is very complex. In fact, something like 1/3 of the brain is devoted to processing vision. Like almost the entire back of your brain It's just about processing what comes in through your eyes. So there's a whole lot going on there that we don't know about. But people are using optogenetic tools to slowly pull apart how that system works. We may understand it in detail at some point to be able to work with the brain of someone who has no access to vision, get them to have those kinds of perceptions. Maybe. Okay, let's take one more question, and then I know I have to run because we have another engagement. So one more question, if not, we'll wrap up. Okay, I think we're good. All right, well, thank you all so much again.
Thank you, everyone.
Too much to carry.